One decision. No press conference, no dramatic announcement, no carefully staged interview, just silence. And somehow that silence sent a shockwave through the entire WNBA. Because when a player doesn't argue, doesn't defend herself, doesn't even explain, but simply steps back at the exact moment the league is negotiating its financial future, that's not random, that's leverage. And it's far more powerful than any viral rant could ever be. When Stephen A. Smith publicly questioned league leadership and openly challenged how this situation was being handled, many people assumed it was just another loud sports media moment. But this wasn't noise for the sake of headlines. His reaction felt different. It felt urgent, like he understood something bigger was unfolding behind the scenes, something structural, not emotional. The WNBA had been riding the highest wave in its history: sold-out arenas, record-breaking television ratings, corporate sponsors suddenly lining up. Sports debate shows that rarely mentioned women's basketball were now leading with it. The energy felt unstoppable. For the first time, the league wasn't fighting for attention, it was commanding it. On the surface, everything looked stable. Growth felt permanent. The breakthrough appeared complete. But underneath that celebration, something fragile was holding it all together. Caitlin Clark didn't criticize the league. She didn't accuse anyone publicly. She didn't threaten to walk away. Instead, she did something much quieter and much more strategic. She declined the next big opportunity many assumed she would automatically accept. No drama, no hostility, just a decision to step back and enjoy her off-season on her own terms. That quiet no carried more weight than any statement ever could. Timing is what made it explosive. Just as the WNBA Players Association chose to opt out of its collective bargaining agreement 2 years early, signaling confidence and a desire to negotiate from strength, the league's biggest star showed that she wasn't dependent on the outcome. On paper, the union's move made sense. Momentum was sky high, viewership was climbing, sponsors were investing. If there was ever a moment to push for a bigger share, this was it. But leverage only works if the foundation underneath it is stable. And suddenly, the foundation looked less secure than anyone wanted to admit. For months, the narrative suggested the league's surge was organic and evenly distributed, that women's basketball had finally reached a new era built on collective strength. But when you actually look at the data patterns, attendance spikes, television numbers, merchandise trends, a different story starts to emerge. Engagement wasn't evenly spread. Attention wasn't universal. The gravitational pull centered around one name. That reality changes everything, because when the player driving the surge demonstrates she is comfortable existing outside the storm while negotiations intensify inside it, the balance of power shifts immediately. Not loudly, not aggressively, quietly. Stephen A's reaction wasn't about outrage, it was about recognition. Recognition that this moment wasn't just contract drama. Recognition that the league may have underestimated how much of its recent surge was tied to a single presence. Recognition that if the wrong move is made now, the consequences could be far more serious than anyone expected. This isn't about one off-season decision, it's about exposure. Exposure of how dependent growth might be. Exposure of how fragile momentum can feel when one central figure chooses distance instead of participation. Exposure of how quickly confidence can turn into uncertainty when leverage gets tested in real time. Because here's the uncomfortable realization settling in across boardrooms and studio sets alike. Caitlin Clark doesn't need chaos to thrive. The league needs stability to grow. And when someone proves they are not trapped inside the system, that's when they gain the most influence. One quiet decision changed everything, and what follows from here may reshape far more than just one negotiation. The gamble didn't start with Caitlin Clark. It started in a negotiation room. At the height of what felt like unstoppable momentum, the WNBA Players Association made a bold decision that caught many casual fans off guard. They opted out of their collective bargaining agreement 2 years early. In simple terms, they chose to reopen negotiations before the current deal expired. It was a calculated risk, one built on confidence. From their perspective, the timing made perfect sense. Attendance numbers were climbing at rates the league had never seen. Television ratings were breaking internal records. Corporate sponsors were not only interested, they were competing. Airlines were finally providing charter flights. Media attention was pouring in from outlets that had ignored the league for years. For many players, it felt like proof that years of effort, sacrifice, and advocacy had finally paid off.
So why wait? If growth was accelerating this quickly, why not secure a larger share of the revenue while the spotlight was brightest? Why operate under an older agreement negotiated before this surge? From a business standpoint, striking at peak visibility can be smart strategy. When leverage is strongest, negotiations tend to swing in your favor. That was the assumption, and on the surface, it wasn't unreasonable. For decades, players had pushed for improved travel conditions, higher salaries, revenue sharing, and better benefits. Much of that progress had been slow, painfully slow. So when the numbers started moving in a dramatic way, the logic likely felt obvious. This is our moment. But momentum can be misleading, because the key question wasn't whether the league was growing, it was why. Was this expansion evenly distributed across teams and players, or was it concentrated around a specific catalyst? That distinction matters more than anyone wanted to admit at the time. The union likely viewed the surge as systemic, proof that women's basketball had reached a tipping point. If that were true, renegotiating early would be a sign of strength. It would signal unity, confidence, and belief in long-term expansion. But if the spike was heavily tied to one star generating disproportionate attention, then the risk profile changes entirely. Opting out early creates uncertainty. It introduces the possibility, even if small, of labor tension, delays, or public friction. In stable environments, that risk can be absorbed. In fragile environments, it can destabilize everything. And this is where the gamble becomes complicated, because corporate sponsors, broadcasters, and investors don't just respond to growth, they respond to predictability. Television contracts are built on projections, brand partnerships rely on continuity. The moment uncertainty enters the equation, caution follows. The players believe they were negotiating from a position of dominance, but negotiations only work if every party believes the engine powering the revenue stream will remain fully engaged. That assumption was about to be tested. What makes this situation even more delicate is timing. The opt-out didn't happen during a downturn, it happened during celebration. That contrast amplified its impact. Instead of reinforcing stability during a record-setting rise, the league introduced volatility at the very moment investors were recalculating expectations upward. From one perspective, it was courage. From another, it was premature. Because if the growth truly was dependent on broader cultural momentum, the risk would be manageable. But if the spike was heavily tied to one star driving new audiences, then labor tension becomes far more dangerous. And the numbers were already hinting at something uncomfortable. The bet was simple. The league is bigger than any single star. The problem is, markets don't operate on belief, they operate on behavior. And behavior was telling a more fragile story than anyone wanted to say out loud. The data didn't whisper, it screamed. For months, analysts tried to frame the WNBA's surge as a broad cultural breakthrough, and in many ways, women's basketball absolutely benefited from long overdue recognition. But when you isolate the numbers, when you strip away the inspirational headlines and look strictly at behavior, television viewership, ticket sales, digital engagement, one trend becomes impossible to ignore. When Caitlin Clark played, everything spiked. National broadcasts featuring her team shattered prior regular season viewership records. Arenas that hadn't sold out in years were suddenly moving every seat. Secondary ticket markets surged. Jersey sales accelerated at levels rarely seen in the league. Social media clips weren't just circulating within WNBA circles, they were going viral across mainstream sports platforms that historically paid little attention to the league. And then came the pattern that changed the conversation entirely. When she didn't play, those same metrics dipped, not gradually, not subtly, sharply. Television audiences that had doubled or even tripled during her appearances slipped closer to historical averages when she was absent. The surge wasn't evenly distributed across the calendar. It followed one player with startling consistency. That doesn't diminish the talent across the league. It simply highlights a market reality. Casual fans weren't just tuning in for women's basketball as a concept. They were tuning in for an event, and that event had a name. This isn't an emotional argument, it's mathematical. Network executives analyze minute-by-minute ratings, sponsors study engagement trends, advertisers measure conversion spikes. They don't operate on narratives, they operate on proof. And the proof showed a gravitational pull centered around one athlete in a way the league had never experienced before. Even road games became spectacles. Opposing arenas upgraded seating plans when her team came to town. Cities moved games to larger venues to accommodate demand. Teams that typically operated in controlled, modest attendance environments suddenly faced national spotlights when she appeared on the schedule.
That kind of impact reshapes economic conversations because it forces one fundamental question. Is the growth systemic or is it catalytic? If growth is systemic, meaning evenly distributed and structurally embedded across the league, then collective bargaining leverage increases naturally. But if growth is catalytic, sparked by a singular force drawing new consumers into the ecosystem, then stability depends heavily on that catalyst remaining active and engaged. And here's where it becomes uncomfortable. The numbers weren't just strong, they were disproportionate. Television contracts often rely on projected upward trajectories. Advertisers commit based on anticipated audience stability. When projections are built around continued star participation, any uncertainty involving that star becomes amplified. Investors aren't emotional about it, they're analytical. That's why Stephen A. Smith's commentary resonated beyond entertainment. He wasn't arguing about personalities, he was referencing economics. The Clark effect didn't just boost interest, it altered expectations. For years, the league fought to expand its reach. Then suddenly, the door was kicked wide open. New fans entered the space. Casual viewers became engaged observers. Media cycles that once overlooked the league began centering it in daily debate. That type of expansion rarely happens evenly across multiple stars simultaneously. It often consolidates around one transcendent figure who shifts the perception of the entire sport. And when that shift occurs, the financial balance recalibrates around it. This doesn't invalidate the achievements of other players. It doesn't diminish their contributions or legacy. But markets reward momentum, and momentum flowed in a very specific direction. So when negotiations intensified and labor uncertainty entered the picture, executives, sponsors, and analysts weren't asking philosophical questions. They were asking practical ones. What happens if the player driving these spikes steps away? What happens if audiences follow her elsewhere? What happens if the volatility introduced during negotiations intersects with the one factor fueling expansion? Those questions aren't dramatic, they're structural. Because once data exposes dependency, leverage shifts, quietly but decisively. And that realization staged the stage for the most strategic move of all. And then came the move nobody could fully explain, because it didn't look like a move at all. As reports circulated about the new off-season 3-on-3 venture, Unrivaled, the assumption around the league was almost automatic. Of course Caitlin Clark would be involved. The rumored financial structure was attractive. Reports claimed equity opportunities were on the table. Veteran stars were publicly aligning themselves with it. On paper, it looked like the natural next step for the most talked-about player in women's basketball. But she declined. No dramatic statement, no criticism of the project, no public distancing from anyone involved. Just a quiet decision to sit it out and enjoy her off-season on her own terms. That's when the speculation exploded. Rumors suggested the offer was substantial.
Some reports claim the league was built with the expectation that her participation would immediately boost its launch profile. Whether every number floating around online was accurate or not, one thing was clear: her presence would have guaranteed instant media gravity. And she still said no. In business terms, that's restraint. In leverage terms, that's power. Because by not attaching herself to the next big venture, especially during a moment of collective bargaining uncertainty, she positioned herself outside the pressure cycle. While negotiations swirled, while debates intensified, while media commentary escalated, she removed herself from the immediate arena without burning any bridges. That absence carried weight. If she had joined Unrivaled, the narrative would have centered on expansion and opportunity. By stepping back, the narrative shifted to independence. Suddenly, analysts weren't asking what she was building, they were asking what she might be distancing herself from. And that question changes tone. There's a difference between leaving something and proving you don't urgently need it. The latter is quieter and more unsettling. Some media voices framed the decision as simple off-season management. Others interpreted it as a strategic pause. A few speculated it was a signal aimed at both the league and the union. It's important to note that no public accusation or confirmation supports those heavier interpretations. But perception matters in negotiation climates, and perception began to shift quickly. Because timing once again amplified the message. This wasn't a random calendar decision. It came during heightened labor discussions, during a period when players were asserting collective leverage. Instead of stepping deeper into the ecosystem, she demonstrated mobility. She showed she could step sideways rather than forward.
And in economics, optionality equals strength. If she wanted exposure, she already had it. If she wanted endorsement deals, they were already secured. If she wanted global attention, that existed regardless of off-season participation. So the question became less about opportunity and more about positioning. Stephen A. Smith didn't label it rebellion. He didn't call it retirement. He described it as something subtler, a quiet signal. Whether intentional or not, the effect was undeniable. The league's most bankable draw had just proven she could disengage from additional ventures without losing relevance. In fact, her absence generated more discussion than participation might have. That's influence. And it created a subtle tension inside the broader ecosystem. If one player can generate headlines by stepping away rather than stepping in, then traditional leverage dynamics no longer operate the same way. There were no public ultimatums, no visible rifts, just distance. But in high-level negotiations, distance can speak louder than alignment. And suddenly, executives, union leadership, media personalities, and investors were all reacting to something that technically never made a sound. Then the focus shifted upward. Because once labor negotiations intensified and star leverage became obvious, attention inevitably turned to leadership. And that's when the temperature rose. Commissioner Kathy Engelbert was already navigating one of the most complex moments in league history. Record growth brings opportunity, but it also brings scrutiny. Every decision becomes magnified, every comment is dissected, every misstep feels amplified in a way it wouldn't during quieter seasons. And suddenly, criticism wasn't staying behind closed doors. Media figures began openly questioning whether the league was handling this surge correctly. Stephen A. Smith didn't just debate ratings, he challenged leadership accountability. When national commentators start discussing whether a commissioner is equipped to manage a moment like this, that's not routine sports chatter. That signals perceived instability at the top. Adding to the tension, reports surfaced about friction between players and league officials. Some statements, according to discussions circulating online, were interpreted as dismissive or out of touch. It's important to be clear,
Much of this conversation has been shaped by media framing and second-hand accounts. Still, perception can be just as powerful as confirmation. And perception started tilting toward disconnect. When player leadership voices frustration publicly, even in subtle ways, it creates a ripple effect. Investors notice, broadcasters notice, corporate sponsors notice. Stability at the top becomes part of the financial conversation. Because here's the uncomfortable reality of rapid growth. Leadership must evolve as fast as the spotlight does. For years, the WNBA operated in a controlled media environment. Coverage was limited, pressure cycles were contained, negotiations happened without national daily debate shows dissecting every angle. That dynamic changed almost overnight. Now every move happens under a microscope. If players feel undervalued, that becomes a headline. If the commissioner attempts to balance financial caution with expansion, that becomes criticism. If negotiations stall, the narrative quickly escalates into crisis language. And during a negotiation window, narrative matters. There's a difference between managing growth quietly and managing growth while facing daily scrutiny from national media personalities. The latter requires near-perfect messaging. Any sign of internal fracture becomes amplified as evidence of deeper structural problems. Rumors began suggesting that alignment between player leadership and league executives wasn't as solid as public statements implied. Again, none of this was officially confirmed as systemic breakdown, but tension doesn't require confirmation to affect perception. And perception affects leverage, because broadcasters and sponsors don't just evaluate numbers, they evaluate climate, they look at leadership cohesion, they assess risk. If a league appears unified during negotiations, confidence remains steady. If cracks appear publicly, uncertainty creeps in. Stephen A's commentary didn't ignite the tension, it reflected that it was already there. His willingness to question the commissioner's handling of the situation suggested that frustration wasn't limited to online debate circles, it had entered mainstream analysis. The timing compounded everything. Leadership scrutiny landed precisely as collective bargaining discussions intensified and as the league's biggest star demonstrated independence. That trifecta, labor negotiations, star leverage, and leadership criticism, creates a volatile triangle.
No organization welcomes that combination, because once confidence and leadership becomes part of the conversation, everything else feels less stable. Sponsors grow cautious, analysts grow skeptical, fans grow curious about what's happening behind the scenes, and stability, which had been the league's most valuable asset during its rise, suddenly felt negotiable. The commissioner wasn't just managing expansion anymore, she was managing perception of control. And in moments like this, perception often becomes reality. While everyone focused on domestic negotiations and media debates, a much bigger factor lingered quietly in the background, one that almost nobody wanted to discuss openly. Caitlin Clark isn't just a national draw anymore, she's a global brand. Basketball is an international business. European clubs operate with aggressive salary structures. Exhibition circuits travel city to city across continents. International sponsors often move faster and pay differently than domestic leagues bound by salary caps and revenue splits. And when a player reaches transcendent visibility, geography stops being a limitation. That changes the leverage equation entirely. There have been increasing conversations, mostly speculative but persistent, about what her earning potential could look like outside the traditional WNBA structure. Overseas leagues have historically paid top women players significantly more than domestic salaries. Add in short-term international tours, global endorsement activations, and appearance fees, and the numbers escalate quickly. Now imagine that earning power attached to someone currently driving the most attention in the sport. Even if she never seriously considers leaving, the mere existence of that option reshapes every negotiation dynamic, because leverage multiplies when alternatives are viable. If the league were her only path to relevance or income, urgency would tilt inward. But when global doors are open, patience becomes easier. That's the part rarely acknowledged during televised debates. Basketball markets in places like Spain, Turkey, Australia, and parts of Asia aggressively pursue talent. International promoters aren't bound by the same long-term development strategies or salary structures as domestic leagues. They evaluate marketability differently. A short global exhibition tour featuring her could draw media attention well beyond a single season. Again, none of this confirms intent. There's no verified indication she plans to step away from the WNBA, but markets don't respond only to confirmed actions. They respond to possibilities, and possibility equals leverage. If she wanted to, she could build a selective international presence that preserves her brand while maximizing revenue. She could host traveling showcases. She could partner with global sponsors independently. She could align with media platforms outside the league's ecosystem. The key word is could. That option alone subtly shifts power. Because now the WNBA isn't negotiating within a closed system, it's negotiating in a global sports marketplace. And in that marketplace, transcendent athletes rarely remain restricted to one structure unless the structure offers them compelling incentives to stay. What makes this dynamic even more powerful is fan loyalty. Modern sports audiences don't attach themselves only to teams, they attach themselves to personalities. If she were to step onto an international stage, many of the new fans drawn into women's basketball through her would likely follow. That portability is valuable. For years, the WNBA operated without facing serious international competition for its most visible American stars. Now, with global digital distribution, international audiences can engage with alternative platforms easily. Social media erases borders, streaming eliminates geographic constraints, and investors understand that. The presence of an escape route, even one that remains unused, transforms negotiations from demands into calculations. If a league assumes long-term loyalty regardless of conditions, it negotiates differently than if it understands loyalty must be continually reinforced. In moments of growth, keeping the central figure engaged becomes just as important as expanding infrastructure. So while headlines centered on labor strategy and leadership tension, a quieter question hovered beneath the surface. What happens if the player driving this surge realizes her ceiling extends far beyond one league? That question may never need to be tested, but the fact that it exists is powerful on its own.
Strip away the emotion, the loyalty, the headlines, and the situation becomes brutally simple. Who actually needs who more right now? For years, the WNBA operated on a foundational belief: the league is bigger than any individual. That philosophy makes sense historically. Sustainable sports organizations cannot depend entirely on one star. They build systems, rivalries, traditions, and depth so the brand survives beyond any single career. But markets don't care about philosophy. Markets react to demand, and demand has been unusually concentrated. Television networks didn't suddenly renegotiate interest out of goodwill. Sponsors didn't flood in purely on long-term optimism. Advertisers didn't dramatically increase exposure because of abstract potential. They responded to measurable spikes in consumer behavior. Games involving Caitlin Clark generated those spikes. Broadcast windows featuring her consistently outperformed others. Engagement metrics weren't evenly distributed, they clustered. That reality complicates negotiation power. When the Players Association opted out of the agreement early, the assumption was that the league needed labor unity to maintain momentum. And that's true in a vacuum. No league functions without its athletes. But the equally critical truth is that not all economic impact within a league is evenly shared.
If one individual is disproportionately driving revenue acceleration, then leverage becomes asymmetrical. This doesn't diminish the importance of collective bargaining, it highlights economic structure. Negotiation strategy relies on pressure points. The union's traditional pressure point is work stoppage or disruption. But if disruption affects the primary revenue engine more than it pressures ownership, the calculus changes. Broadcasters have invested based on projected upward growth. Corporate sponsors have aligned marketing campaigns around the current surge. If games are canceled, delayed, or diminished in value due to instability, those financial streams don't simply pause indefinitely. Contracts contain contingencies. Payments often depend on product delivery. Now the uncomfortable math surfaces. If viewership drops without her participation and instability discourages casual fans from returning, the revenue pool shrinks, and revenue sharing percentages only matter when there is revenue to share. That's the leverage paradox. The Players Association believed the timing amplified their power, but timing only works if growth is resilient. If growth is personality-driven and fragile, volatility becomes expensive. From the outside, it may appear like a power struggle between labor and management, but beneath that layer sits a deeper question. Is the current surge durable without the one player who catalyzed it? If the answer is no, even partially, then dependency exists, and dependency creates vulnerability. Caitlin Clark doesn't need public confrontation to exert influence. Her value is validated by numbers. She doesn't need dramatic statements to shift negotiation tone. Simply maintaining optionality is enough. Meanwhile, the league faces a more complex equation. It must balance long-term structural equity for all players with the immediate economic reality of a star-driven surge. Ignore the collective, and resentment grows. Ignore the catalyst, and revenue stalls. That balancing act becomes nearly impossible when both sides feel justified. So who needs who? The league needs its players collectively to function. The players need the league as an organized platform. But right now, the league's expansion narrative appears especially tied to one athlete's participation. That means the margin for miscalculation is thin. Because if she remains engaged, growth likely continues. If she disengages, even partially, the ripple effect would be immediate. This isn't about ego, it's about economics, and economics rarely rewards denial. In the end, there was no explosive announcement, no dramatic walkout, no headline that officially declared a turning point. And yet, a turning point happened anyway. This entire situation didn't shift because of a speech or a protest. It shifted because of positioning. The Players Association made a bold move, believing the league's surge gave them maximum leverage. Leadership tried to manage rapid growth under an intense spotlight. Media personalities amplified the tension. Investors watched closely. Fans argued online. But the most powerful response wasn't loud. It was quiet. Caitlin Clark didn't threaten to leave. She didn't attack the commissioner. She didn't publicly side with one faction over another. She simply demonstrated that her influence doesn't depend on constant participation. She showed she could step back, decline opportunities, avoid the noise, and still remain the gravitational center of the conversation.
That's the power shift. Because true leverage isn't about shouting demands. It's about proving you have options. For years, the WNBA fought to build stability. Now it has visibility. But visibility changes the rules. Once growth is tied to a single catalyst, decision-making becomes more delicate. Every negotiation carries higher stakes. Every leadership comment gets amplified. Every absence gets noticed. What makes this moment historic isn't conflict, it's exposure. Exposure of how dependent the current surge may be. Exposure of how fragile momentum can feel when uncertainty enters the room. Exposure of how one player, without saying a word, can influence boardroom dynamics simply by existing outside the pressure cycle. And here's the reality no one wants to overstate, but no one can ignore either. If she stays fully engaged, the league likely continues its upward climb. If instability escalates and she chooses distance, the economic consequences would be immediate. Not because the league lacks talent, not because the sport lacks depth, but because new fans often attach themselves to transformative figures first before embracing ecosystems second. This doesn't mean collapse is inevitable. It means miscalculation is dangerous. The quietest moves often leave the deepest impact. Loud reactions dominate headlines for a day. Strategic silence reshapes negotiations for months. Right now, professional women's basketball stands at a crossroads. Growth is real, momentum is tangible, but leverage has shifted in a way that can't be reversed simply through messaging. The question moving forward isn't whether the league can survive without one player. It's whether it can sustain this level of acceleration if that player ever decides her leverage is better used elsewhere. History rarely remembers the loudest moments. It remembers the subtle ones that altered direction. And this may be one of them.